On January 15th, 2014, I showed up in the squadron on a day that was going to change my life forever. And you don't know it when those days are going to be, but when I showed up in the squadron, it was just like another day. Busy ready room. Pilots, we're constantly doing like 5 or 10 different jobs at once. We've got ground jobs and collateral duties. We're planning some sort of dining out. I'm like trying to get a bagpiper online for this event we're going to do. Like you're constantly just doing all sorts of other I
Sure.
think people think, oh, you're a pilot, you get to focus on learning tactics all day and flying airplanes, but no, like you've got like a full-time ground job, and then you got the full-time job of being a fighter pilot and studying and keeping on top of that. But I showed up that morning in the squadron. My squadron mate Fisty was at the SDO desk standing duty. And to keep things light with a morbid sense of humor that we oftentimes, develop and utilize in that world, with the constant stress that's on us, he took a shark tracker app off his phone and he put all these GPS tagged locations of sharks that were out in the working airspace that we were going to utilize that day out over the Atlantic called the Whiskey 72. He put that up on the whiteboard behind the duty desk. And so he had all the airspace drawn out, and then he had all these little red marks of all these sharks. And they were no shit, like these are real GPS tagged sharks that were out there. And he was joking with me. He said, "Oh, today would be a terrible day to eject. There is below freezing air temps. There was a bit of wind, so the ocean was a bit churned up. The water temp was at 37 degrees Fahrenheit at the nearby buoy. And now there's this 16-foot, 3,500-pound great white shark named Mary Lee directly underneath my airspace. And
And so
so
this wasn't something he normally did. This was just
no,
by chance.
this was just on this day. It was like a funny thing he found and decided to do. I mean, he was like always doing funny stuff around the squadron, which was very helpful, for everybody. Everybody loved it. Uh, but that was not a normal part of our brief or anything. It just happened. And so after like maybe an hour after that conversation with Fisty, I was out over the Atlantic practicing dogfighting. And we got to our last set of fighting for the day. We had hit Joker fuel, meaning we had just enough fuel to knock out one last quick set of fighting. And so we set up for that last round of dogfight. So this is probably the epitome of what people think when they think fighter pilot. It's a couple aircraft or more within visual range trying to shoot each other down. In this case, it's training, but our training is mimicked as close as possible to the real thing. While we're not actually hosing off real missiles or shooting actual 20 Mike rounds at one another, we're still doing all the mechanics and we're still like validating these shots and everything to see like no shit like who won this fight or not. And it's very dynamic. You're flying the aircraft, talking on multiple radios. You're operating an attack radar, sensors, defensive systems. You're sort of this four-dimensional chess match that's happening very rapidly, all while you're under a lot of physical stress. You're pulling 7.5 Gs, and at that kind of G force, now your body weighs 1,600 or more pounds. Just your head and helmet is like having 150 pounds on your head. So you're in the midst of a high intensity interval training workout while you're doing this. You're
Hmm.
you're squeezing your legs, your core, you're fighting to breathe, and so there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
And in this fight, we came to the merge where our paths cross, and I rolled my jet inverted and I pulled my aircraft down at the ocean. Now, typically, this vertical maneuver would take about 5,000 feet of vertical airspace. I was at 10,500 feet when I started this maneuver. We have a 5,000-foot hard deck that's set for training purposes. So in case we do make a mistake, there's that 5,000 feet of extra room, almost a mile of space for screw ups. Um, so I maneuvered the aircraft, not fully realizing the airspeed that I had gotten up to, which was above standard for our setup and multiple reasons that kind of had cascaded into this decision. But I made a mistake and I maneuvered the jet nose low at a very high airspeed. All would have still been okay, except as the aircraft accelerated and I was pointed basically straight at the ocean, I hit what's called the G bucket. And this was a point where the aircraft thought there were bombs on the wings that weren't actually there. And so it overrode my control input in an effort to protect itself from overstressing what it perceived as a bomb loadout. Um,
Hmm.
And this was kind of the worst case scenario. It'd be like going around a sharp corner in a sports car and then having your steering wheel kick back halfway. Only instead of skidding off the road, I'm now stuck in this dive at the ocean. And the way I perceived it was I was pulling that 7.5 G's. I could feel that 1,600 pounds of force as I'm craning my neck up to keep sight of my adversary. I can feel that, and all of a sudden it just eased. And it was like the worst feeling in the pit of my stomach as I look down and I'm face down at the ocean is rushing up at me, and the
Jeez.
aircraft is not responding to my command. And that's called out of control flight. When the aircraft does not respond to what you're telling it to do, now you're an OCF. Um,
And was
and
this
very
something
quickly,
you did wrong, or was it a malfunction with the aircraft?
it was a combination. So there was multiple causal factors after the investigation, but one was we set up in a non-standard setup that ended up kind of creating a dangerous situation. Two, I maneuvered the aircraft nose low above Top Gun recommended airspeed. Three, I had this G limiter function kick in from the flight control computer software. And unfortunately, that function has killed many more senior aviators prior to me and caused mishaps. And I know a guy that it killed after my mishap. Most other Generation 4 fighters and all Generation 5 fighters, as far as I'm aware, they have a similar system, that protection system, so it won't overstress the aircraft, but that is linked to a ground proximity warning system. So that same system on the aircraft that can detect a pending collision can override that G limiting function. And even I think the F-22, if that thing is on a collision course, it'll actually override the pilot's control input and it'll pull like 10 Gs to pull those guys out of a dive to save them. Unfortunately, the Super Hornet, for whatever reason, there's no communication between that ground proximity warning system and the flight control computer software. So
Hmm.
it kind of it creates this dangerous situation that can be very insidious, and it just rapidly onsets at the worst possible moment. And like I said, unfortunately, it's killed several people and kind of exacerbated my situation. But all those things come together, and the ocean's rushing up at me. I hear the radar altimeter go off, letting me know I just went through the hard deck. And very quickly, the ocean's just rushing up, filling the canopy. And 2 seconds before impacting the ocean, traveling at 695 miles per hour, so nearly the speed of sound, I pulled the ejection handle. And just the sense of dread and the overwhelming ground rush, I knew there was no way I was going to be able to recover this aircraft. And in a last ditch attempt to survive, I pulled the handle. A normal ejection is very violent. Even if you're straight and level below 180 knots airspeed, guys still get flail injuries where they damage their arms and shoulders. Guys still get their spine compressed because when you pull that handle, a rocket motor ignites and it boosts you out of there. And there's a 50 G instantaneous force that just like crushes your spine. And that eases to
Wow.
12 to 14 Gs. So imagine yourself weighing 14 times what you weigh, sitting here on the ground, and it just crushes you. And then to make matters worse, I impact the airflow at that speed. So I basically impacted the sound barrier with my body. And it turns out the human body is not terribly aerodynamic at the speed of sound. But that just ripped my head off, traumatic brain injury, smashed my face to hell. I broke my C1 in my neck from my head whipping back. I broke my left scapula, my shoulder. My arms flailed so violently it destroyed my left radius and ulna, severing the median nerve that controlled my left hand. My upper arm bones broke. The right humerus tore through my right brachial artery, causing internal bleeding. The gear on my vest all ripped off. The dry suit that I was wearing to protect me from that frigid ocean water all shredded open, leaving me exposed to the elements. Um, my legs were flailing around so violently from that airflow that the steel toe boots on my feet effectively came like wrecking balls, smashing open my lower legs. My tib fibs were fractured in both sides. Chunks of my bone were falling out of my shin.
Wow.
And this all just happens in an instant. By
And
the time I
do you pass out as this all happens?
Yeah, the last linear memory I have is right as I just sensed that ocean rushing up and going, oh shit. And then my body just naturally took over. The training kicked in. I assumed that position and I was out. But from there, I have no linear memory, but I have in the form of flashbacks over the course of years, a lot of times like night terrors in the middle of the night trying to sleep, would get back clips. But I've been able to recreate this story very accurately from all the investigation that went into it. The aircraft data recorder, the black box that they got recovered, gave me a lot of this information, and we've been able to really accurately reconstruct exactly what went down and why. But while I was in the water real time, I was pretty out of it in a large part from that head injury. But I do have clips of the parachute that had just saved my life very quickly sunk underneath that ocean swell and started to pull me under, drowning me alive. And so I had a lot of clips of being in that situation, thinking, one, I'm bleeding out, and there's a shark that's going to finish me off at any minute, and just that terrible sense of dread when you need a breath of air and you can't get it is a pretty awful sensation. Um,
Did your team assume you were dead?
no, my flight lead, fortunately, he spotted my parachute opening, and so he was able to drop a GPS mark of my position, which was now very rapidly changing as I submerged into that ocean current and was being pulled along. But he very quickly coordinated an on-scene commander role and got the search and rescue effort underway. And so they had Coast Guard, they had multiple Navy helicopters en route. They had a fishing vessel that got over there to my position, a Coast Guard vessel that was en route. So there was a lot of effort coming. Whether I was dead or alive, they were gonna do their best to get me out of that ocean. And it took about 2 hours before a Navy H-60 showed up and was able to get me out with a rescue swimmer, and rushed to a level one trauma center in Norfolk, Virginia, where when I arrived there, I was, destroyed. I had coded several times on the flight. I was lucky to be alive. I was extremely hypothermic when they took my core body temperature. I was at 87 degrees Fahrenheit, so near freezing. Should have been dead from hypothermia, but they said had my dry suit actually functioned properly, I would have bled to death way before anybody got there. So it ended up being a crazy twist of fate that kept me alive. But they had to pump the water out of my lungs. They had to treat me for rhabdo because my kidneys were so overwhelmed from all this tissue breakdown. My arms and legs were destroyed. I had multiple blood transfusions for all the blood that I had lost. And once I was semi-stable, they induced a coma and rushed me into surgery. And I spent the next week undergoing over a dozen trauma surgeries to salvage my extremities from amputation and to rebuild my skeleton. Um, and after another week, they were trying to get me to come out of that coma, and it didn't look like I was going to come to. But after 2 full weeks in a comatose state, I eventually the lights started coming back on, and I had no memory of what had happened. I didn't know where I was between the pain meds and the head injury. I was just very loopy. But eventually, the medical staff came in and explained, "Hey, you've been in a high-speed ejection. You're likely never going to walk again. We don't think you'll ever be able to use your arms again, and your military flying career is over." And I remember I thought that somebody had tied me down on the bed with this blanket, where this blanket was made of lead or something because I couldn't move, but it was because I was paralyzed. And it turns out if you want to make a fighter pilot do something, tell them it's impossible because what the doctors had said was I couldn't do it. And so I just started working my ass off every day to send signals to my nervous system to get moving. And over the course of the next 3 months, undergoing all sorts of different therapies, getting loaded up on a massive amount of pharmaceuticals for the
Hmm.
pain management side of things, I was at least able to get around on a walker and be discharged and continue as an outpatient. And I spent the next 2 years undergoing more surgeries, overcoming prescription drug addiction, and and eventually getting all the medical waivers required and going through an investigation of the mishap. And I actually returned to the cockpit of the F-18 Super Hornet.
Yeah, which is incredible. I'm just wondering, because you're going over it very quickly, but it's a very long recovery process. I'm wondering in the immediate, knowledge that of what at least they're telling you, you may never walk, you may never fly again, or you're going to struggle to walk and all that. Um, what you do, as you said, with flying is extremely physical. And I
Mhm.
would say like what you're able to do physically defines very much of who you are, your job and even just your passion. So was there a feeling of like, because I would just imagine I don't even want to be here anymore because we've had people on the show like Army Ranger Mike Schlitz, who's lost both of his arms in combat, severely burned the majority of his body, and now he's doing great. But he's written articles, I believe, for Ranger Up at one point saying that, yeah, there was a time he thought of suicide. And, we do know that veteran suicide and military suicide is a huge, huge issue. I would just imagine someone who lives their life on the edge like you do, hearing you can't do any of this anymore, it would almost feel like why live? And I'm wondering if you experienced any of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I kind of came to and started to realize what was going on, like my career is probably over. I'm going to be physically messed up the rest of my life. I just crashed an $89 million jet into the ocean. Like, is that going to have repercussions? Are they going to crush me and hang me out to dry? Like, there was an overwhelming amount of darkness that was just crushing me down into this dark little pit, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I made this conscious decision in that darkness where I could have bit off on all the things that were going on and be like, you're right. My life's over. I'm going to be paralyzed. I'm a piece of shit. Like, my life's over and I would just want to kill myself. There was that option. And that was the overwhelming, like that was the fire that was just raging inside of me.
Sure.
But I also had this little tiny ember that was, what if I do get better? What if I get to come back into this hospital wearing my flight suit with my wings on my chest and be like, guess what? I'm back. And that was the little tiny ember that I decided to stoke. And I started to visualize myself back. Like, what's it
Hmm.
going to feel like? And that little bit started to build and build. And that pushed me into my therapy sessions full hearted and just ready to charge. And I really turned a lot of my focus onto my physical rehabilitation and just like hitting it as hard as I could. Like, all I'm going to be able to do today is wiggle my pinky. But you know what? That's like, that's like a new PR for me at this point. So, uh, that was a mindset thing that came out of this that I didn't realize was even happening at the time, but looking back at it now, like I realized that was a pivotal moment. I think so many other people face that same point on so many levels in life. Like, we get into like a really bad situation, we have something overwhelming that's happening in our life, and there's this opportunity to feed that fire and just bite off on the darkness and the bitterness and like lead ourselves into some really bad shit. But in those moments, every moment of the day, it doesn't matter where you're at and what's happened in the past or where you think you're going, but you also get to make this conscious decision of like, what if I do something different? What if I go the other way? What if I what if I have some optimism and hope? And then feed that fire. And before you know, that little ember is going to grow. And over time, those sort of energies shifted from that darkness and all this terrible shit that was raging to now the hope and energetic and the chance that I'm going to get back was raging. I was physically getting better, mentally getting better, performing again. Like, I was able to max out the military physical fitness test again, the PRT. And
Wow.
so I was, those momentums built, but it took just constant effort, discipline, consistency of working towards that goal. It's not just you imagine it and then it happens. Every day and every moment I was working towards that. But that's what I was feeding. And that's what I think really led me to the recovery. And I think anybody can really apply to their life, whatever you're going through.
Yeah, I would imagine after you endure that, you're like, there's nothing worse you could endure. And I'm sure looking back, you're like, anything that you stressed over was nothing in comparison to this. I'm curious as well. You said when we were speaking about your journey joining the military that your parents weren't exactly thrilled you were doing this. When they saw you in the hospital, I mean, to me, this sounds like, other than you having to make the ultimate sacrifice, like this is their worst nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, what was their feel like? What was their response to what had happened?
Yeah, I mean, it was heartbreaking for them. My mom especially was just torn apart. Like, she was so worried because this was her little boy that she wanted to protect, and she had her apprehensions about me going in because she was fearful that something like this could happen. And when my family actually got the call from my commanding officer to say, "Hey, your son's been in a mishap," it was actually kind of a good thing that they misunderstood him because he had said, "Oh, he had fallen." I don't know, but they basically, my mom and dad kind of interpreted it as like I was like climbing up the ladder to get in the jet and I like fell off and like, I don't know, bonked my head on the concrete at the runway. So their whole trip to come see me, like that's what's in their mind. Like, oh, he's all right. He just fell off the airplane, like that doofus. He's hit his head, growing up way harder than this probably. But when they showed up, like it all sunk in, like, oh no, he ejected from a jet at the speed of sound. He is jacked up, and it was pretty hard on my parents, definitely.
I would imagine, man. So, how long was the process from hospital bed to back in the cockpit? And also, once you were flying again or about to fly, I would just imagine there had to be some overwhelming sense of fear that the last time you had done this is you had to go through what you went through.
Yeah, I mean, I had been working at that goal. It took me 2 years from my ejection date, almost exactly 2 years before I went back into train to fly in the F-18. Um, it it was a long, difficult road, especially the prescription drug addiction stuff was a battle that a lot of other vets have to face. But that whole time, my goal was to get back into the cockpit, and so it was kind of like it was a little bit anxiety when I finally got the word of, hey, you're going to go back and fly, because it was like the day of. I was, at this point, I was focused on my therapy, but during the day I was working like an office job at a computer. And the wing commodore comes in and he's like, hey, what are you doing today, Gil? I was like, oh, just working on this. And he's like, you want to go back and fly? I was like, yeah. And I'm thinking like I'm gonna have a few weeks to like at least get ready. And he's like, all right, you're classing up today. And it's literally on the other side of the same hangar. And I go down and I kicked it back off again, right back into the jet.
Thanks for checking out Battle Line Podcast. This is just a smaller clip from our latest episode, which you can check out in its entirety by clicking here. While you're watching, be sure to hit the subscribe button and thumbs up the video to show your support. Now, if you'd really like to help us out, click the thanks button below to make a donation. It goes directly to us in keeping Battle Line Podcast going.